Every summer since my dad passed, I make the trip up to the Kenai Peninsula to fish for sockeye salmon. It started as a way to feel close to him again, doing something we used to do together when I was a teenager. But over the years it became my thing, my way of resetting before another school year of teaching fourth graders in Seattle. My birthday falls in late July, and turning 37 alone on a riverbank with nothing but the sound of rushing water and birdsong felt like exactly what I needed. I had been doing this solo trip for 6 years without any real incident. A few close calls with moose, one scary moment when I slipped on wet rocks and almost went into the current, but nothing that made me question whether I should keep coming back. The spot I always use is about 4 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a trail that most people skip because there are easier fishing spots closer to civilization. That remoteness was always the appeal. I flew into Anchorage on a Tuesday morning and picked up my rental truck, a beat-up Ford that smelled like cigarettes and prior renters who did not believe in air freshener. The drive down to the peninsula took about 4 hours, and I stopped in Soldotna to grab last-minute supplies and check in with the ranger station like I always do. The guy working the desk, a younger ranger I had not seen before, warned me about increased bear activity in the area. He said the salmon run was strong this year, which meant the browns were coming down from higher elevations earlier than usual. I thanked him and told him I had bear spray and air horn and knew how to store my food properly. He gave me this look, not condescending exactly, but like he wanted to say something more and decided against it. I wish now that I had asked him what he was thinking. I wish I had paid more attention to the weight behind that look, instead of brushing it off as a ranger doing his job. The hike in took me about 2.5 hours with my pack, which was heavier than usual, because I had brought extra food for a 5-day stay. I reached my usual campsite around 4 in the afternoon, plenty of daylight left to set up, and maybe get a few casts in before dinner. The spot sits on a slight rise about 60 feet from the riverbank, sheltered by a thick stand of spruce trees on 3 sides. The river curves there, creating a natural pool where the salmon tend to gather before pushing upstream. I had caught my limit here every single year. I set up my tent, hung my food cache from the bare wire that someone had installed years ago between 2 tall spruces, and took a walk down to the water to check conditions. The river was running a bit higher than I remembered from previous years, probably from snowmelt, and the water had that murky, glacial color that makes it hard to see more than a few inches below the surface. I noticed fish jumping out near the middle of the current, silver flashes catching the late afternoon sun, and I felt that familiar excitement in my chest. That first evening was perfect. I caught 3 nice sockeyes before the light started fading, kept 2 and released 1, and cooked dinner on my little camp stove while listening to the river. I did everything right with my food prep, cleaned the fish downstream from my camp, washed my hands and arms thoroughly, changed into clean clothes that I kept sealed in a dry bag. I was careful. I am always careful. Around 10, which is still pretty bright that far north in July, I noticed movement on the opposite bank. Maybe 200 yards away, a large brown shape moving through the brush. I could not see it clearly, but I knew what it was from the way it moved, that distinctive rolling gait. It did not seem interested in me, just working its way along the far shore, probably fishing in its own spots. I watched until it disappeared into the trees. Then I got into my tent and zipped everything up tight. I remember thinking how lucky I was to see one from a safe distance. I remember feeling grateful, not scared. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of something moving through the brush near my tent. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I lay completely still, barely breathing, my hand wrapped around the bear spray I always keep next to my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled. I could track them by sound, moving from the tree line behind my tent toward the river, then back again. At one point they stopped, and I heard this sound, a deep huffing breath followed by a low grunt. It was close enough that I could smell it, that musky, wet dog smell mixed with something rotten, probably fish. I do not know how long I lay there, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, the sounds moved off toward the river and I heard splashing in the distance. I did not sleep again that night. I just lay there with my eyes open, listening to every small noise, my body so tense that my muscles ached by morning. When the sun came up around 5, I got out of my tent to check the area. My legs were shaky and I felt that sick exhaustion you get when adrenaline has been pumping through you for hours. The ground near the tree line was torn up, deep gouges in the soft earth where something had been digging. And then I saw the tracks. They were massive, bigger than any bear print I had ever seen in my 6 years of coming here. I put my boot next to one of them for reference, and the print was easily twice the size of my foot, with claw marks extending several inches beyond the toe pads. I am not a wildlife expert, but I have seen enough brown bear tracks to know that this was an unusually large animal. The tracks led from the woods to a spot maybe 20 feet from my tent, circled around, and then headed down toward the river. I stood there looking at how close they came to where I had been sleeping, separated by nothing but a thin layer of nylon, and I seriously considered packing up and hiking out right then, but I talked myself out of it. That is what I keep coming back to, that moment of decision. I told myself the bear was just passing through, that it had not tried to get into my food cache, that it was probably more interested in the salmon than in me. I told myself I had driven 8 hours and hiked 4 miles, and I was not going to let one close encounter ruin my trip. I checked my food hang, which was untouched, and I made noise while I cooked breakfast, banging pots together and talking loudly to myself like all the guides recommend. I even did some fishing that morning, though I stayed closer to camp than usual, and kept my bear spray clipped to my waders at all times. I caught 1 salmon and released it because I did not want to deal with cleaning fish and creating more smells. The whole time I was on the water, I kept scanning the banks, the tree line, the bend in the river where I had seen the bear the night before. Nothing. The day was bright and warm, birds singing, river flowing, and I started to relax a little. I started to think maybe I had overreacted. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was sitting on a rock near the water, eating a granola bar and resting my feet when I saw it. The bear emerged from the brush on my side of the river, maybe 150 yards upstream. It was enormous, easily the biggest brown bear I had ever seen outside of photographs. Its fur was dark brown, almost chocolate-colored, with a distinctive silver patch on its shoulder. It walked to the water's edge and stood there, and then it turned its head and looked directly at me. I want to be clear about this because it matters. The bear saw me. It knew I was there. And instead of doing what bears usually do when they encounter humans, instead of running away or at least moving off, it started walking toward me along the riverbank. Not charging, not running, just walking. Steady and deliberate, like it had somewhere to be and I was on the path. I stood up slowly and grabbed my bear spray with one hand and my air horn with the other. I started backing away from the river toward my campsite, keeping the bear in my sight the whole time. I pressed the air horn, and the blast echoed across the water, loud enough to hurt my ears. The bear paused for a second, maybe 2, then kept coming. I yelled and waved my arms over my head, trying to make myself look bigger. Nothing. It just kept that same steady pace, closing the distance between us. 75 yards now, maybe less. I could see its face clearly. The small dark eyes, the dish-shaped profile, the way its ears were pointed forward with focus and intent. My brain was screaming at me to run, but I knew that was the worst thing I could do. You cannot outrun a brown bear. You cannot outswim one either. I kept backing up, stumbling over rocks and roots, and I hit the air horn again, 3 short blasts. The bear did not even flinch. It reached the spot where I had been sitting and it stopped there, sniffing the rock, sniffing the ground where I had dropped my granola bar wrapper. And then it lifted its head and looked at me again, and it made this sound, a low, rumbling grunt that I felt in my chest more than heard. I do not know what made me decide to go for the river. Maybe some survival instinct kicked in, or maybe I just panicked and made a stupid choice. My campsite was behind me, but the bear was between me and the trail that led back to the road. The river was to my left, and on the other side of the river was more wilderness. But at least it was distance. At least it was something. The bear started moving again, faster now, and I turned and ran for the water. The cold hit me like a wall when I plunged in, that glacial runoff so cold it locks up your muscles and steals your breath. I was only in up to my waist, but the current was strong, pulling at me, and I could barely feel my legs. I pushed forward, half swimming and half wading, trying to reach the far bank. I heard splashing behind me, and I did not look back. I just kept going, my arms numb and clumsy in the freezing water. The riverbed was all loose rocks and sudden drop-offs, and twice I went under, swallowing water that tasted like ice and silt. When I finally dragged myself onto the opposite bank, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. I turned around, expecting to see the bear swimming after me or already on my side of the river. But it was just standing at the edge of the water on the far bank, right where I had gone in, watching me. It did not try to follow, it just stood there, and after a minute or two it turned and walked back toward my campsite, disappearing into the trees near where my tent was set up. I was soaking wet, freezing, starting to feel that dangerous sleepiness that comes with hypothermia. And all my gear, my food, my truck keys, my phone, everything was on the other side of the river, with a bear that had just chased me into glacial water. I had my bear spray still clutched in my hand, but that was it. No dry clothes, no fire starter, no way to call for help. I started walking downstream along the bank, trying to keep moving, trying to generate body heat. I knew there was a fishing lodge about 6 miles downriver. I had seen it on my map when planning the trip. 6 miles through dense brush and uneven terrain in wet clothes with the temperature dropping as evening approached. I did not think about whether I could make it. I just walked. It took me almost 5 hours to reach that lodge. By the time I stumbled out of the tree line and a guest spotted me, I could not feel my feet and my lips were blue. They wrapped me in blankets and called for a medical helicopter because my core temperature had dropped to 92 degrees, which is apparently when organs start having trouble. I spent 2 nights in a hospital in Anchorage being treated for moderate hypothermia and mild frostbite on 3 of my toes. The Rangers went back to my campsite the next day and found my tent shredded, my food cache pulled down from the wire and scattered everywhere. They found tracks all around the site, the same massive prints I had seen that morning. They told me later that there had been reports of a large male brown bear in that area, exhibiting unusually bold behavior around humans, possibly because someone had been feeding it earlier in the season. They never caught it as far as I know. I still go fishing every summer, but not there, never there again. And every time I see a bear in the distance now, even in a zoo, I feel my chest tighten and I remember that steady walk along the riverbank, those small, dark eyes fixed on me. And I remember how it feels to be looked at not as a threat or a curiosity, but as something else entirely. My truck died somewhere between Talk and Delta Junction on a stretch of highway that looked exactly like the last 100 miles. White, flat, and empty. The temperature gauge had been showing -47 for the past hour, and I remember thinking that number seemed almost fake, like something from a documentary about Antarctica, rather than a road I was actually driving on. I had taken this relocation job from Seattle to Fairbanks because the salary was too good to pass up, and my 10-year high school reunion a few months back had been a reminder that everyone I grew up with was buying houses and having kids while I was still splitting rent with roommates. The plan seemed reasonable when I mapped it out. Drive the Alaska highway in early December, get settled before the holidays, start fresh in January. I had packed blankets, extra food, flares, a full tank of gas, everything the internet told me to bring. But sitting there watching my dashboard light up with warnings before the engine gave one last shudder and went silent, I understood that all the preparation in the world means nothing when you are alone in a place that wants to kill you. I turned the key again and again, maybe 20 times, and each attempt produced a weaker sound until there was nothing but a faint click that reminded me of a dying heartbeat. The heating system stopped the moment the engine quit. and I could feel the cold pushing into the cabin almost immediately, like it had been pressed against the windows just waiting for its chance. I grabbed my phone knowing there would be no signal, and I was right. No bars, no data, nothing but a useless rectangle of glass and metal. Outside, the sun hung low even though my watch said it was barely 2 in the afternoon. That strange Arctic winter light that looks more like a permanent sunset than actual daytime. I figured I had maybe 3 hours before full darkness, and the thought of spending a night in this truck with no heat made my chest tight. I looked out at the road in both directions and saw absolutely nothing. No cars, no buildings, no smoke from distant chimneys, just an endless white plain broken only by the dark line of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and for the first time since I started this drive, I felt genuinely afraid. I tried to remember what I had read about survival in extreme cold. Stay with your vehicle. That was the main advice everywhere online. Your car is shelter, it is visible to rescuers, it protects you from wind. But the articles I had read were written for situations where someone might actually come looking for you, where the temperature was maybe -20 and you could survive a night bundled up in blankets. This was different. At -47, the math changes completely. I had read somewhere that exposed skin gets frostbite in under 5 minutes at these temperatures, that your core body temperature starts dropping almost immediately once you stop producing heat. The blankets I had brought were good for a camping trip, not for a night in an unheated metal box when the air itself feels like it is trying to freeze your lungs. I did the calculation in my head. If no one drove by tonight, and the temperature dropped even further after dark like it always does, I would be dead by morning. That was not pessimism, that was just physics. I remembered passing a sign about 30 minutes back, something about a highway maintenance station 8 miles ahead. At the time I barely noticed it, just another green rectangle on an endless road. Now that sign felt like a lifeline, the only piece of information that might save me. 8 miles was not that far. I had run half marathons before, back when I lived in Seattle, and thought jogging along the waterfront made me some kind of athlete. But 8 miles in this cold, in snow boots and a jacket designed for Pacific Northwest rain rather than Arctic winter, with the sun going down, and no guarantee that the station would even be staffed. That was something else entirely. I sat in the truck for another 10 minutes, watching the windows start to frost over from the inside, feeling my fingers getting stiff even with gloves on. The decision made itself. Staying meant certain death by morning. Walking meant maybe dying, but also maybe living. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with the granola bars and water bottles I had brought, wrapped a scarf around my face until only my eyes were exposed, and stepped out of the truck into cold that hit me like a physical wall. The first breath I took outside felt like inhaling broken glass. The air was so cold that my nostrils stuck together for a second, and I had to breathe through my mouth just to get oxygen in. My eyes watered immediately, and I could feel the moisture trying to freeze on my eyelashes, turning them stiff and clumped. I started walking north along the highway, keeping the asphalt under my feet because I knew that wandering off into the snow would mean losing my sense of direction within minutes. The snow on the road had been packed down by whatever sparse traffic came through, but it was still slippery, and each step required concentration. I told myself to keep a steady pace, not too fast because sweating would be deadly. I had read that wet clothing in extreme cold is basically a death sentence, that the moisture pulls heat from your body faster than the air alone ever could. So I walked like I was on a casual stroll, except every part of my body was screaming that something was wrong, that I should be running, that I needed to get somewhere warm right now. After maybe 20 minutes, I started to notice that I could not feel my toes anymore. I was wearing 2 pairs of socks and my heaviest boots, the ones I had bought specifically for this trip, and none of it mattered. The cold had found a way in, like it always does, creeping through the rubber soles and the insulation and the wool until my feet felt like blocks of wood at the end of my legs. I kept walking because stopping was not an option, but I started doing this thing where I would curl my toes inside my boots, trying to force blood into them, trying to feel anything at all. My fingers were next. even inside the gloves, even tucked into my jacket pockets. The tips went numb first, then the knuckles. Then that numb feeling started creeping up toward my wrists. I checked my watch and realized I had been walking for almost 40 minutes, which meant I had covered maybe 2 miles at most. The maintenance station was still 6 miles away, and the sun had dropped noticeably lower, painting everything in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if they did not mean I was running out of time. Around the 1-hour mark, something changed in my head. I noticed it happening, which is the strange part. I was aware that my thoughts were getting slower, like my brain was a computer running too many programs at once. I would start thinking about something like how far I had walked or whether I should eat one of the granola bars, and then I would just lose the thread of it completely. I found myself stopping in the middle of the road for no reason, just standing there staring at the horizon, and I had to physically force myself to start moving again. My body wanted to stop. Every cell in me was saying, just sit down for a minute, just rest, just take a break. I knew that was the hypothermia talking, that sitting down meant dying. But knowing something and feeling something are two completely different things when your core temperature is dropping and your brain is not getting enough warm blood. I started talking to myself out loud, just to have something to focus on, just to keep my mind from drifting into that soft gray fog that kept trying to swallow my thoughts. The road started to look different after a while, or maybe I was just seeing it differently. I could have sworn there was a building up ahead at one point, a dark shape against the snow, and I walked faster toward it for maybe 5 minutes before realizing it was just a shadow, some trick of the fading light on the landscape. That scared me more than anything had so far. If I was already seeing things that were not there, how much longer before I walked off the road entirely without realizing it? The highway was my only guide, the only thing keeping me pointed in the right direction. And if I lost it, I would be wandering in circles until I collapsed. I tried to focus harder, tried to keep my eyes on the asphalt directly in front of me, but my vision kept going blurry at the edges, and I had to blink constantly to clear it. The tears would freeze almost instantly, gluing my eyelids together for a half second each time, and wiping them away with my frozen gloves just made it worse. I realized I had stopped feeling cold, which should have been a relief, but I knew it was actually a very bad sign. When you stop shivering, when the cold stops hurting, that means your body has given up trying to warm itself. That means you are in serious trouble. I do not know exactly when I left the road. That is the part that haunts me when I try to piece together what happened. The gap in my memory, where the highway just disappears, and suddenly I was walking through open snow with no idea how I got there. One moment I was following the dark line of asphalt, telling myself to keep going, keep moving, and the next I was knee-deep in powder with nothing around me but white in every direction. I must have wandered off during one of those foggy moments when my brain checked out, maybe saw another phantom building in the distance and walked toward it without thinking. I tried to turn around, tried to find the road again, but everything looked exactly the same. Flat white ground meeting gray-blue sky in a perfect circle around me, like I was standing in the center of an empty dome. I picked a direction and started walking, telling myself it had to be the right way. But even as I moved, I knew I was guessing, knew I could be walking deeper into nothing instead of back toward the highway. The sun was almost gone now, just a thin red line on the horizon, and the temperature was dropping even further. I could feel it in my chest, each breath harder than the last, like the air itself was thickening into something my lungs could not process. My legs stopped working properly somewhere in that white emptiness. First they just felt heavy, like I was wading through water, and then they started refusing to bend the way I wanted them to. I fell twice, maybe 3 times, and getting back up took longer each time. The last time I went down, I remember lying there in the snow and thinking how soft it was, how it almost felt warm compared to the air, how maybe I could just rest here for a minute before continuing. Part of my brain was screaming at me to get up, screaming that this was exactly how people die, but that voice seemed far away now, like someone yelling from another room. I managed to push myself to my knees, then to my feet, but standing felt like an achievement that took everything I had. I looked around and realized I could not see anything anymore. Not the road, not the sun, not any landmark at all. Just darkness creeping in from every direction and the snow beneath my feet, and this incredible tiredness that made every thought feel like pushing a boulder uphill. I took a few more steps, maybe 10 or 20, and then I stopped. Not because I decided to stop, but because my body simply would not go any further. My legs locked up, my knees buckled, and I went down into the snow one final time. I woke up in a hospital in Fairbanks 3 days later, and for the first few hours I had no idea where I was or how I got there. A nurse told me that a snowplow driver found my truck on the highway and called it in, and that search and rescue teams had been looking for me since the next morning. They found my trail of footprints leading away from the vehicle, followed them for about 4 miles along the road, and then tracked where I had wandered off into the open terrain. The footprints just stopped, she said, in the middle of a flat white field about 2 miles from the highway. No body, no sign of where I went after that. They searched for hours with dogs and helicopters, expanding the radius, checking every depression in the snow. A volunteer on a snowmobile finally spotted me nearly a mile from where my tracks ended, lying face down in a shallow ditch that had been invisible from the air. My core temperature when they got me to the medical center was 26 degrees Celsius. The doctors said anything below 28 is usually fatal, that most people do not come back from that. I lost 3 toes on my left foot and 2 on my right, plus the tips of 4 fingers. The surgeon told me I was lucky, and I wanted to laugh at him, but I did not have the energy. What I cannot stop thinking about even now is that gap between where my footprints stopped and where they found me. Almost a full mile of distance with no tracks, no trail, nothing to show how I got there. The rescue team leader visited me in the hospital and admitted he had never seen anything like it. The snow was undisturbed, fresh powder that would have shown every step, but there was just nothing, like I had been picked up and set down somewhere else. He asked if I remembered walking that distance, and I told him the truth, that I do not remember anything after falling that last time until I woke up in this bed. The doctors say it was probably some kind of automatic response, my body moving on its own while my conscious mind was completely shut down. A last survival instinct that kept me crawling toward that ditch where the wind was blocked and the snow provided insulation. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe my body saved itself while I was not home. But sometimes late at night, when I look at the stumps where my toes used to be and feel the phantom ache in my missing fingertips, I wonder about those invisible steps. I wonder what part of me was still walking when the rest of me had already given up. I drove through Alaska thinking I understood cold, thinking I was prepared, and I learned that there are things about your own body and your own mind that you will never understand, not even when they save your life. Working at a temporary construction camp in Alaska felt like a strange pause in my life, something I told myself was just a means to an end. I'd taken the job because the pay was good, and I needed to clear some debts, and the camp promised short rotations and long stretches of time off. At that point, my life was simple and quiet, mostly work, sleep, and the occasional call home when the satellite signal cooperated. The camp itself sat far from any real town, surrounded by uneven ground, frozen mud, and a horizon that never felt close. Rows of portable trailers were bolted into the dirt like they might slide away if no one watched them. Most of us were strangers to each other, passing through, carrying our own reasons for being there. That made it easy to keep your head down and mind your business. It also made it easy for things to happen without anyone asking too many questions. The day everything started to bother me wasn't dramatic at first, just oddly quiet. A guy named Trevor, who bunked 2 trailers down from me, didn't show up for breakfast. No note, no warning, just his locker cleared out and his boots gone. People said he'd quit overnight, which wasn't unheard of, but the way everyone accepted it felt rehearsed. This wasn't the first time either. Over the previous months, workers had vanished from the schedule between shifts. No goodbye drinks, No heated arguments with supervisors. Nothing you'd expect from someone leaving suddenly. Management always brushed it off as personal issues or better offers elsewhere. The explanations were thin, but nobody pushed back. In a place like that, asking questions made you stand out. That night I worked the late shift, doing equipment checks near the edge of the camp where the lights barely reached. The generators hummed unevenly, and the cold crept through my gloves no matter how tightly I clenched my fingers. Somewhere past the trailers, I heard raised voices, low and sharp, like an argument being swallowed by the wind. I couldn't see who it was, only the outline of someone moving between structures, staying close to the shadows. When I walked closer, the voices stopped instantly, leaving behind an empty stretch of gravel and a feeling that I'd interrupted something I wasn't meant to see. Later, in the break room, a newer worker named Eli sat staring at the floor, jaw clenched, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. He clocked out early and didn't come back. By the next morning, Eli's trailer was locked and stripped bare, same as Trevor's. This time, though, I noticed scuff marks near the steps, deep grooves in the mud that looked like someone had been dragged or pushed hard. I brought it up quietly to a supervisor, who gave me a tight look and told me to focus on my job. That response stuck with me more than the marks themselves. Over lunch, a few of us traded glances but kept our mouths shut, the unspoken agreement hanging heavy in the air. Everyone sensed there was something ugly underneath these disappearances. The camp's isolation made it feel like its own world, one where rules bent easily and consequences stayed far away. By the end of that morning, I realized the problem wasn't just people leaving. It was what might have been happening to them before they did. After that, I started paying closer attention to the little things people usually ignored. Conversations would stop when certain footsteps passed by the trailers. A few workers flinched at raised voices, even when it was just joking around. One night during dinner, I noticed bruising along the neck of a guy named Marcus, half hidden by his jacket collar. When I asked if he was okay, he forced a laugh and said he'd slipped on ice. The explanation didn't match the marks, which were too narrow and uneven. He left camp 2 days later without collecting his last paycheck. Management posted his position as open before his bunk was even cleaned out. It felt like the camp itself swallowed people whole, erased them, and moved on. The tension peaked during a night shift when one of the welders, Aaron, failed to check in at the end of his rotation. His radio crackled with static when we tried to reach him, and the supervisor delayed organizing a search, insisting Aaron probably wandered off to cool down somewhere. That excuse made no sense in freezing conditions, especially with the terrain around us. When we finally went looking, we found his helmet near a storage container, dented and smeared with dark residue. No blood trail, no signs of a fall, just silence and the wind dragging loose plastic against metal. By morning, Aaron was officially listed as having quit mid-shift. Seeing that typed out on the board felt unreal, like watching someone rewrite reality. A few days later, investigators arrived after someone finally contacted authorities outside the camp. They spoke to us one by one in a makeshift office, asking careful questions about threats, fights, and people leaving suddenly. What surprised me was how similar everyone's stories were once they felt safe talking. Intimidation in dark hallways, warnings delivered in whispers, physical confrontations that were never reported. One name kept surfacing, always followed by nervous pauses. The camp's setup made it easy for one person to control space and information, especially with new workers rotating in constantly. Oversight was minimal, records sloppy, and complaints quietly buried. Listening to it all laid out made me realize this wasn't a series of bad coincidences. The investigation uncovered years of ignored reports and unofficial settlements, all designed to keep the project running without disruption. The person responsible had learned exactly how far they could go, without triggering intervention, exploiting isolation and fear like tools. Workers who resisted were pressured into leaving, while others stayed silent to protect their paychecks. Eventually, the suspect was removed from the site under guard, though details were never fully shared with us. The camp didn't shut down, it just adjusted, pretending the problem had been solved cleanly. Even after things returned to a surface-level normal, the atmosphere never recovered. Every sound after dark carried weight, and trust between co-workers felt permanently damaged. I stayed long enough to see the investigators leave and the company issue a short statement about improved safety protocols. Nothing about the people who vanished, nothing about Aaron, nothing about the fear that had settled into the camp like a second climate. A few trailers were moved, a new supervisor rotated in, and we were told to report anything unusual. The words sounded empty by then. At night, the camp still felt watched, even with extra lighting and new faces around. People avoided being alone after dark, pairing up for cigarette breaks or bathroom runs. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts, broken by every sound of metal shifting or boots crunching outside. The place had learned our routines, and we couldn't unlearn what it had shown us. The day I decided to leave came quietly, without drama. I packed my duffel in the early morning, hands moving on instinct while my mind replayed small moments I hadn't questioned before. The way certain doors were always locked, the lack of cameras near storage areas, the silence from management when complaints surfaced. None of it felt accidental anymore. I turned in my badge without explaining myself, and no one asked why. That part disturbed me the most. It was as if the camp expected departures, accepted them as part of its design. When the transport truck pulled away, I watched the trailers shrink into the distance, lined up neatly like they hadn't held anything terrible inside them. Months later, back in normal life, the memories still surface at odd times. A generator hum can pull me right back to those nights, or the smell of diesel mixed with cold air. I read about similar camps online, and see the same patterns repeated in different places. Temporary jobs, isolated locations, workers who pass through without roots. It creates gaps where accountability should be, and those gaps invite the wrong kind of people. I don't know what ultimately happened to everyone who disappeared. Some may have escaped before things got worse, others might not have been so lucky. That uncertainty is harder to live with than a clear answer. I'm sharing this here because places like that don't advertise their dangers. They sell opportunity, fast money, and the idea that you can endure anything for a short time. What I learned is that isolation changes the rules, and silence can be trained into people without them noticing. If you ever find yourself somewhere remote where people vanish quietly and no one wants to talk about it, pay attention. Leaving without explanation might look strange from the outside, but sometimes it's the only option left. I walked away with my life and a story that still doesn't sit right. Others didn't even get that much. November in Alaska feels like the world is slowly dying, and that particular November felt worse than most. I had been covering crime stories for the Anchorage Daily Herald since my journalism school graduation back in 2009, staying in this frozen corner of the country because the isolation bred stories nobody else wanted to touch. My editor dropped a folder on my desk containing 6 missing persons cases spanning 15 years, all connected to an abandoned copper mine called Raven Shaft near a forgotten town named Ketchum Falls. The mine had been closed since 1987 after a collapse killed 4 workers, but hikers and amateur explorers kept wandering in over the decades. None of them came back out. Local authorities had stopped sending search parties after the 3rd disappearance because the cave system was too unstable, too deep, and too cold. The families never got answers. The cases went cold, and something about that silence made me volunteer to investigate. I spent 3 weeks researching before I ever set foot near that mountain. The mine entrance sat about 40 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a rough trail that became impassable once the heavy snow arrived in December. I connected with a geological survey team from the University of Fairbanks, who had been trying to get funding to map the cave system for years. Their leader was a woman named Ingrid Solberg, maybe 50 years old with sun-damaged skin and a handshake that could crush walnuts. She had lost a graduate student to Raven Shaft in 2014 and had been petitioning the state to either seal the entrance permanently or fund a proper documentation expedition. When I told her about the article I wanted to write, she offered me something better than an interview. She invited me to join a 5-person team heading into the mine that Friday to recover whatever evidence they could find before winter sealed the mountain for good. I said yes without hesitating, which, looking back, was the first of many mistakes. Our team assembled at a ranger station about 20 miles from the site on a Friday morning, so cold that my breath crystallized on my eyelashes. Besides Ingrid and myself, there was her colleague Desmond Yates, a soft-spoken geologist in his early 60s, who had mapped caves across 3 continents, and 2 younger researchers named Cynthia Park and Jonah Fielding. Cynthia handled the audio and video documentation equipment, a serious woman with cropped black hair who barely spoke during the drive-up. Jonah was the safety coordinator, responsible for the ropes, the harnesses, and the emergency protocols that I prayed we would never need. He had this nervous habit of checking his gear over and over, running his fingers along the carabiners like rosary beads. The ranger who met us was a grizzled man named Cliff Bjornson, who had been stationed in this region for over 20 years. He made us sign liability waivers that essentially said the state of Alaska bore no responsibility if we died in that hole. He also told us that if we were not back by nightfall, nobody was coming to find us until spring. The hike to Raven Shaft took nearly 4 hours through terrain that wanted to kill us with every step. The trail, if you could call it that, wound through dense spruce forest before climbing a rocky slope scattered with loose shale and patches of black ice. Ingrid led the way with the confidence of someone who had made this journey before, though I noticed her pace slow as we approached the final ridge. The mine entrance appeared suddenly, a dark wound in the gray mountainside framed by rotting timber supports that had somehow survived decades of harsh winters. A faded warning sign hung crooked from a rusted chain, the words barely legible beneath layers of grime and lichen. The opening was maybe 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, sloping downward at a steep angle into absolute darkness. Standing there, feeling the cold air rushing up from the depths like the mountain was exhaling, I understood why people called this place cursed. Not because of anything supernatural, but because it felt hungry in a way that only truly dangerous places can feel. We descended into Raven Shaft just after noon, roped together in a line with Jonah at the front and Desmond bringing up the rear. The temperature dropped dramatically within the first 100 feet, and the quality of darkness changed from the soft gray of an overcast day to something thicker, something that seemed to press against our headlamps like a living thing. The main shaft angled downward for about 300 meters before opening into a large chamber that the original miners had used as a staging area. Rusted equipment still littered the floor, pickaxes and ore carts and coils of ancient rope turned brittle with age. Our boots crunched on a mixture of gravel and ice crystals that had formed over decades of water seeping through microscopic cracks in the rock. Ingrid pointed her light toward the far end of the chamber, where 3 tunnels branched off into different directions, each one disappearing into its own private darkness. She explained that the left tunnel led to the collapsed section where the 4 miners had died in 1987. The middle tunnel went deeper into the mountain, descending another 200 meters before dead-ending at a flooded shaft. The right tunnel was where most of the missing persons had last been seen, according to the sparse evidence that search teams had recovered over the years. We took the right tunnel, moving slowly and carefully along a path that grew narrower with every step. The walls were slick with moisture, and in several places we had to duck beneath rock formations that jutted down like broken teeth. Cynthia documented everything with her camera, capturing the strange beauty and the undeniable menace of a place that had swallowed so many people whole. About 40 minutes into the tunnel, Jonah stopped us with a raised fist. His headlamp had caught something reflective ahead, wedged between 2 rocks near the base of the wall. He crouched down and pulled out a hiking boot, faded orange with a distinctive zigzag pattern on the sole. Inside the boot, still laced tight, was a wool sock. Ingrid checked her files and confirmed that the boot matched the description of gear worn by a hiker named Russell Adkins, a 24-year-old college student who had entered Raven Shaft alone in 2016 and never returned. We found only the one boot, no sign of the other, and no sign of Russell. Cynthia photographed the discovery from multiple angles while I stood there wondering what kind of circumstances would cause someone to leave behind a single boot in a place like this. The tunnel opened into a second chamber about an hour later, smaller than the first but with a higher ceiling that disappeared beyond the reach of our lights. This room felt different immediately, and it took me a moment to understand why. There were signs of habitation everywhere. A sleeping bag lay unrolled against the far wall, its fabric torn and stained with something dark that could have been mud, or could have been blood. Nearby sat a camping stove, 2 empty water bottles, a scattered pile of energy bar wrappers, and a backpack with its contents dumped across the stone floor. Ingrid approached the scene carefully, instructing everyone to stay back until she could assess the situation. She crouched beside the backpack and read the name embroidered on its strap, aloud. Gretchen Moody. According to Ingrid's research, Gretchen had been part of a group of 4 amateur spelunkers who entered Raven Shaft in October of 2017. The group had planned a 2-day exploration and packed supplies accordingly. When they failed to return after 5 days, authorities mounted a limited search that recovered nothing. Now we were looking at proof that at least one of them had survived long enough to set up camp deep inside this mountain. Desmond found the audio recorder tucked inside a crevice near the sleeping bag, protected from the elements by an overhang of rock. It was a small digital device, the kind hikers use to document their journeys, and miraculously, the battery still held a faint charge. Ingrid wanted to wait until we returned to the surface to examine the contents, but Cynthia argued that we needed to know what we were dealing with before going any deeper. The group voted, and curiosity won. We gathered in a loose circle, while Cynthia connected the recorder to a portable speaker she carried in her kit. The first file was dated October 17, 2017, recorded in the cheerful voice of a young woman who introduced herself as Gretchen. She described the group's excitement about exploring a cave system that few people had ever documented. The other voices in the background belonged to her companions, a man named Isaac, another woman named Shelley, and a fourth member whose name I could not quite make out through the static. They sounded happy. They sounded alive. And somehow knowing what came next made listening to those first innocent minutes almost unbearable. The second recording was made 2 days later, and the change in tone was immediate. Gretchen's voice trembled as she explained that a rockfall had blocked their exit route. Isaac had tried to find an alternate path but returned after several hours with bad news. Every passage they explored either dead-ended or looped back to the same chamber. Their food was running low. Their flashlight batteries were failing one by one. Shelley had injured her ankle during the initial collapse and could barely walk. The fourth member, whose name was finally clear in this recording as Bo, kept insisting that he had heard movement somewhere deeper in the tunnels. Not animals, he said. Footsteps. Human footsteps. The others dismissed him as paranoid, but Gretchen's voice carried a note of doubt that suggested she was not entirely convinced. The recording ended abruptly with the sound of something falling in the distance, followed by Shelley screaming, and then silence. We sat in that cold chamber, 5 people huddled around a speaker, listening to the echoes of a nightmare that had played out in this exact spot years before we arrived. The third recording was the worst. Gretchen spoke in a whisper, her words rushed and broken by long pauses where she seemed to be listening for something. 6 days had passed since the collapse. Isaac was dead. She did not explain how or why, only that it had happened during an argument about their remaining water supply. Bo had disappeared into one of the side tunnels 2 days earlier and never came back. Shelley's ankle had become infected, and she spent most of her time unconscious, burning with fever. Gretchen described the darkness as a weight pressing down on her chest, the silence broken only by Shelley's labored breathing, and the constant drip of water somewhere in the distance. She mentioned the footsteps again. Bo had been right, she said. Someone else was in these tunnels. She had heard them too, always just beyond the reach of her dying flashlight, always moving away when she called out. She begged whoever found this recording to tell her mother that she had tried to survive. She begged them to bring her body home. The recording ended with a sound that none of us could identify, a low, scraping noise that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, followed by Gretchen whispering a single word that sounded like "run." Nobody spoke for a long time after the recordings ended. Ingrid finally broke the silence by announcing that we had collected enough evidence and needed to begin our ascent before we lost too much daylight. I noticed that her hands moved with a new urgency as she packed the recorder into a protective case. Jonah started organizing our gear for the return journey, counting heads as he always did before any movement. He counted twice, then a third time. His face went pale in the harsh white light of our headlamps, and he asked a question that turned my insides to ice. Where was Desmond? We all looked around the chamber, calling his name into the darkness, our voices bouncing off the wet stone walls and returning to us distorted and strange. Desmond had been standing at the edge of the group just minutes ago, examining some markings on the wall near the tunnel entrance. Now that spot was empty. His pack lay on the ground where he had set it down, but the man himself had vanished without a sound. Cynthia pointed her camera light toward the tunnel we had entered through, then toward two smaller passages on the opposite side of the chamber that we had not yet explored. Nothing. No movement. No answer to our increasingly frantic calls. Jonah wanted to search immediately, but Ingrid overruled him with a voice that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. She reminded us of the protocols we had all agreed to before entering the mine. If someone became separated, the group would mark the location, return to the surface, and contact authorities with proper rescue equipment. Going deeper into an unstable cave system to search for a missing person was exactly how more people ended up dead. I understood her logic, but standing there in that chamber surrounded by the belongings of people who had died alone in the dark, the thought of leaving Desmond behind felt monstrous. We compromised. Jonah and I would check the two unexplored passages for exactly 5 minutes each, while Ingrid and Cynthia stayed at the camp to maintain a light beacon. The first passage curved sharply after about 30 feet and ended in a wall of collapsed rubble that looked decades old. The second passage went deeper, angling downward at a steep grade, and about 100 feet in, my headlamp caught something that stopped me cold. A footprint in the mud. Fresh. Pointing away from the chamber, heading deeper into the mountain, the tread pattern matched the boots Desmond had been wearing. I called his name one more time, my voice swallowed by the tunnel ahead. Nothing came back except a faint echo and something else. Something that might have been the wind moving through cracks in the rock, or might have been breathing. Jonah grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the chamber. Our 5 minutes were up. When we returned to Ingrid and Cynthia, I told them about the footprint, expecting Ingrid to change her mind about the search. Instead, her expression hardened into something I recognized from years of interviewing people who had made impossible choices. She said that Desmond knew the risks better than any of us. She said that if he had walked deeper into that tunnel on his own, there was a reason, and if he had been taken, then whatever took him was still down there with us. Either way, 3 more bodies would not bring him home. We gathered what evidence we could carry, including Gretchen's recorder and the photographs Cynthia had taken, and we began our ascent. The climb back to the surface felt twice as long as the descent. Every sound made us flinch. Every shadow seemed to move at the edges of our lights. I kept looking back, hoping to see Desmond's familiar silhouette catching up to us, but the darkness behind remained absolute and empty. We emerged from Ravenshaft just as the last gray light of day was fading from the sky. Cliff Bjornsson was waiting at the ranger station with coffee and questions. When we told him about Desmond, his face registered no surprise, only a weary kind of resignation that suggested he had heard this story before. He made calls to the state police and the search and rescue coordinator, but I could tell from his tone that nobody expected a recovery operation. The official report, which I obtained months later through a records request, concluded that Desmond Yates had likely become disoriented in the cave system and fallen into one of the many unmapped shafts that riddled the lower levels. His body was never recovered, The entrance to Raven Shaft was sealed with concrete and steel bars the following spring, and a new sign was erected warning that trespassers would face criminal prosecution. I published my article in February, though the editors cut most of the details about the recordings and focused instead on the broader issue of abandoned mine safety. The families of the missing contacted me for months afterward, desperate for any information I had not included in the story. I told them what I could. I did not tell them about the footsteps that Gretchen heard, or about the fresh boot print leading into darkness, or about the sound I heard just before Jonah pulled me back from that tunnel. A sound like someone whispering my name from very far away, in a voice that almost sounded like Desmond. Seattle had given me everything I thought I wanted: a steady job at a busy clinic, a decent apartment, friends who understood the chaos of 12-hour shifts. But somewhere around my 10th year as a nurse practitioner, the routine started to feel like a slow suffocation. I needed something different, not just a change of scenery, but a complete reset. The kind you only get when you put 1,000 miles between yourself and everything familiar. When I saw the posting for a public health position in Koyukak, a village of about 200 people in interior Alaska, something clicked. My nursing school classmates were buying houses in the suburbs, scheduling play dates, posting photos of their kitchen renovations. Meanwhile, I was signing a 2-year contract to work in a place most people could not find on a map. The salary was decent, housing was provided, and the job description mentioned everything from wellness checks to emergency response. My mother cried when I told her. My father just shook his head and asked if I had lost my mind. I arrived in Koyukak on the last day of August, when the tundra was still gold and rust-colored, and the daylight stretched past 9 at night. A bush plane dropped me at a gravel airstrip about half a mile from the village center, and a man named Irving Tukala picked me up in a battered pickup truck that looked older than me. Irving worked for the tribal council and had been assigned to help me settle in. He was maybe 60, with deep lines carved into his face and hands that looked like they had been shaped by decades of hard labor. He did not say much during the drive, just pointed out landmarks: the community center, the general store, the fuel depot. When we passed a cluster of houses set apart from the others, he slowed down slightly. "Moreau family," he said, his voice flat. "They keep to themselves." I nodded, not thinking much of it at the time. Small towns always have their dynamics, their unspoken boundaries. I had no idea that those 3 words would become the first thread of something I wish I had never pulled. My first few weeks went smoothly enough. The health clinic was a small building with peeling paint and equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum, but it was functional. I saw patients for everything from ear infections to diabetes management, and most people were friendly in that reserved, cautious way that comes from living in tight-knit communities. I learned to read the silences as much as the words. A woman named Ruthie Anaktavuk became my unofficial guide to village life. She worked at the general store and had a way of explaining things without making me feel like an outsider. She told me which families had been there for generations, which had arrived more recently, and which ones I should just leave alone. When I asked about the Moreaus, her face changed. Not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. "They handle their own problems," she said, and then she changed the subject to the weather forecast. I let it go, but something about her reaction stayed with me like a splinter I could not reach. It was mid-September when the first real incident happened. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, came into the clinic with her mother. The girl had a gash on her forearm that clearly needed stitches, deep enough that I could see the white of tissue beneath the blood. But when I started preparing the suture kit, the mother grabbed her daughter and pulled her toward the door. "We changed our minds," she said, not meeting my eyes. "It will heal on its own." I tried to explain the risk of infection, the likelihood of scarring, but she was already gone. I stood there in the empty exam room, holding a needle and thread, feeling like I had just witnessed something I did not understand. When I mentioned it to Ruthie later that day, She got very quiet. "That was Celeste Moreau," she finally said. "Her daughter Elise. They do not come to the clinic, they never have." I asked her why, and she just shook her head. "Some questions are better left alone out here." October came fast, and with it the cold. Not the crisp autumn chill I knew from the Pacific Northwest, but something deeper. A cold that seemed to seep into the walls, into your bones, into your thoughts. The daylight was shrinking rapidly, and by the end of the month we had maybe 6 hours of weak sunlight before the darkness swallowed everything again. I spent more time in the clinic going through old records, partly out of boredom, and partly because the incident with the Moreau girl kept nagging at me. The filing system was a mess, decades of paper records stuffed into cabinets with no real organization. But as I started sorting through them, patterns began to emerge. Death certificates mostly. In a village this small, you expect to see deaths from the usual causes: age, accidents, the occasional illness. What I did not expect was how many of those accidents involved the same handful of family names: Moreau, Ivanov, Tulik. Over and over again. Drownings, falls, exposure, hunting mishaps. All ruled accidental by whatever authority had signed off on them, but the frequency was staggering. In the past 15 years, I counted 11 deaths among those 3 families alone. 11, in a village of 200 people. I started making a list, writing down dates and names and causes of death on a yellow legal pad I kept hidden in my desk drawer. Maybe I was paranoid, maybe I was just a city girl looking for drama in a quiet place. But then I noticed something else. The deaths were not random. They clustered around the same time each year, mostly between late October and early December, when the village was at its most isolated. When the rivers froze, but the ice was not yet thick enough for safe travel. When the bush planes stopped flying because of weather. When getting out of Koyukak became nearly impossible. I sat in my small clinic office with that legal pad in front of me, the wind howling outside, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Someone was dying in this village almost every year, right around this time, and everyone was pretending it was normal. I made the mistake of asking questions. Not directly, not at first. I thought I was being subtle. I mentioned to Irving that I had been organizing the old records and noticed a lot of accidents over the years. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then said, "Alaska is a dangerous place. People die." That was it. Conversation over. I tried a different approach with Ruthie, asking about the Ivanov and Tulik families, whether they were related to the Moreaus. She stopped stocking shelves and turned to face me with something in her eyes I had not seen before. Fear, maybe, or warning. "You are a good person," she said slowly. "You came here to help, so let me help you. Stop looking at those old papers. Stop asking about those families. Just do your job, get through the winter, and when spring comes you can decide if you want to stay or go. But right now you need to stop." Her voice was barely above a whisper by the end. I wanted to argue, to push back, but the look on her face made the words die in my throat. She was genuinely afraid, and not for herself. That night I came home to find my cabin door unlocked. I always locked it. That was a habit from Seattle that I never broke. My first thought was that maybe I had forgotten, that the isolation was getting to me. But when I stepped inside and turned on the light, I knew someone had been there. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. But my desk drawers were open, and the yellow legal pad where I had been keeping my notes was sitting in the middle of my bed. It had been in my clinic office. Someone had taken it, brought it here, and left it where I would be sure to find it. A message. I picked up the pad and flipped through it. All my notes were still there. Every name and date I had written down. But on the last page, someone had added a single sentence in handwriting that was not mine. "The winter is long and accidents happen." I stood there in my freezing cabin holding that legal pad, and for the first time since I arrived in Koyukak, I felt truly afraid. Not curious, not unsettled, afraid. Because whoever wrote that note knew exactly what I had been doing, and they wanted me to know that they knew. I should have stopped. Any rational person would have stopped. But fear does strange things to you. Sometimes it paralyzes, and sometimes it pushes you to do exactly what you should not do. The next morning, I went to the tribal council office and asked to see the village census records from the past 20 years. The woman behind the desk, someone I had never spoken to before, looked at me like I had asked for the nuclear launch codes. She said the records were not available to outside contractors, that I would need special permission from the council elders. I asked how I could get that permission. She smiled without warmth and said the council only met once a month, and the next meeting was not until December. I walked out of that office knowing I had just put another target on my back. That afternoon, I tried to call my mother using the satellite phone at the community center, the only reliable way to reach the outside world. The phone was broken. It had worked fine the week before. The man who ran the center, a quiet guy named Amos Chukwu, said a part needed to be ordered and it would take a few weeks. He did not look at me when he said it. November arrived like a door slamming shut. The last supply plane came in on the 3rd, and the pilot told me the weather window was closing fast. He asked if I wanted to leave, said he could make room for one more passenger. I thought about it. I thought about the note on my bed, the broken satellite phone, the way people had started looking at me differently, like I was a problem that needed to be managed. But leaving felt like surrendering to something I did not understand, and some stubborn part of me refused to give them that satisfaction. So I watched the plane take off and disappear into a gray sky, and I told myself I had made the right choice. By the middle of the month, the river was frozen solid, and the snow was waist-deep in places. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero, then 40. The village became a small cluster of lights in an endless darkness, cut off from everything. And somewhere out there in one of those houses, people were waiting for something. I did not know what, not yet, but I was about to find out. It was November 19th when Ruthie came to my cabin after dark. She had never visited me at home before, and when I opened the door and saw her standing there in the cold, her breath coming out in white clouds, I knew something had changed. She pushed past me without waiting to be invited, and stood in the middle of my small living room, rubbing her hands together. "There is going to be an accident soon," she said, her voice tight. "The Moreaus owe a debt. They have owed it for 3 generations. The Ivanovs and the Tullocks, they owe debts too. That is how it works here. That is how it has always worked." I asked her what she meant by debt, and she told me a story that made everything click into horrible place. Decades ago, before the village had any real connection to the outside world, the founding families made agreements with each other. Land rights, hunting territories, marriages, resources. When someone broke an agreement or wronged another family, there was a price. Not money, not property, blood. A life for a life passed down through generations until the debt was paid. It sounded insane, like something out of a history book about feudal societies. But Ruthie was not joking, and the fear in her eyes was absolutely real. She told me that the Moreau family had one more death owed to the Chukwu family, a wrong committed by someone's great-grandfather that had never been settled. This year, the debt was being called in. Elise, the little girl I had tried to help in September, was the one they had chosen. That was why her mother refused medical treatment. In their minds, there was no point in healing someone who was already marked. I felt sick. I asked Ruthie why she was telling me this, why now, and she said it was because I was the only person in the village who might actually do something. Everyone else had grown up with this system. They accepted it the way you accept gravity, not because it was right, but because it had always been there. Outsiders were usually discouraged from staying long enough to notice anything. But I had noticed, and I had kept asking questions, and now I was the only wild card in a game that had been playing out for generations. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my cabin with every light on, thinking through my options. Running was not possible. The snow was too deep, the cold too extreme. and the nearest town was over 60 miles away through wilderness. The satellite phone was still broken. I had no way to contact anyone outside. But I had something else: the clinic. Medical supplies, locked cabinets, and most importantly, a shortwave radio that I had seen in the back storage room during my first week. It was old and covered in dust, probably left over from the 80s, but it might still work. Before dawn, I walked to the clinic through knee-deep snow, my flashlight cutting a thin beam through the darkness. The radio was exactly where I remembered it. Took me almost an hour to figure out how to operate it, my fingers numb and clumsy. But finally I managed to reach a state trooper station in Fairbanks. I told them everything: the pattern of deaths, the threats, the little girl who was in danger. The officer on the other end sounded skeptical at first, but something in my voice must have convinced him, because he said he would send a team as soon as the weather cleared. He told me to stay inside, keep my head down, and wait. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I stayed in the clinic, sleeping on the exam table, eating canned food from the emergency supplies. On the second day, someone tried the door handle in the middle of the night. It was locked, and whoever it was eventually went away, but I did not close my eyes again until morning. On the fourth day, I heard the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the frozen air. 2 state troopers and a child welfare officer landed on the outskirts of the village, and within hours, Elise Moreau was in protective custody. I do not know exactly what happened after that. I was evacuated on the same helicopter and never went back. I heard later that several people were arrested, that the investigation uncovered evidence of at least 7 deaths that were being reclassified as homicides. The village of Koyukak was all over the news for a few weeks, and then the world moved on to other horrors. I still have the yellow legal pad with the threat written on the last page. Sometimes I take it out and look at that handwriting, and I wonder who wrote it. I wonder if they are still out there in some other small place keeping old debts alive. And I wonder how many other villages exist where the winter is long and accidents happen and nobody asks why.